even with different kinds of synapses and different kinds of neurotransmitters and different kinds of receptors, and the ability to fine tune those with neuromodulation to make them more or less sensitive, it's still not enough to explain or understand how the nervous system is able to integrate this information, make decisions, and respond accordingly. So we need to talk about neural integration. Now, there are cells in our brains that have as many as 40,000 synapses. So neurons in our cerebral cortex have 40,000 other neurons talking to them. How does that neuron make sense of all of that information? So here I've drawn a neuron with 40,000 synapses, not actually 40,000, and I also realize that the color's not great, so I've drawn these in red and green. Each one of these neurons that is synapsing with our postsynaptic neuron is either inhibitory, that's the red, or excitatory, that's the green. So one of the ways that this neuron can make sense out of what's happening is by counting up the number of excitatory neurons that are firing and the number of inhibitory neurons and deciding whether that means yes or no. It's sort of like conducting an election. So this is called summation. And what you can see down here is that if only one excitatory neuron fires, we only get one excitatory postsynaptic potential. And that's not enough to reach the threshold, which is here. But if multiple neurons fire, then each excitatory postsynaptic potential builds on the next, and we get closer to the threshold and finally reach the threshold to have an action potential. It turns out that it requires several neurons sending excitatory postsynaptic potentials or creating excitatory postsynaptic potentials in order for this neuron to reach the threshold and have an action potential. And of course, it would take even more if some of the inhibitory neurons were also firing, because they would bring the membrane potential down instead of bringing it closer to the threshold. So this neuron basically takes a survey or adds up, sums up the excitatory postsynaptic potentials and the inhibitory postsynaptic potentials in order to see whether it reaches threshold and should have an action potential. The other thing that happens is called labeled line code, and I don't even know if you can see it here. I can't move back anymore. So this neuron is able to tell which, or is programmed, let's say, to know where each of these neurons is coming from. So if this particular neuron, the synapse, lights up or sends a signal, then this neuron might be like, oh, okay, that's from the eye. So if I'm getting a local potential from here, that means that there's information about the eye that I'm passing on. But this one over here might be sending information from the elbow, just to pick apart. If you imagine that the neuron is actually has a whole bunch of buttons in front of it, like a terminal, and then each neuron lights up a different button, it can put a label on each of those buttons and say, okay, when this one fires, then that means that it's coming from this part of the body, which means that that information is this. So that's called labeled line code. Another thing that can happen, or that does happen, is that some of these neurons are more sensitive than others. So let's say that this neuron here is very sensitive. So whatever happens over here that it's sensing, it sends a signal no matter what. It doesn't take very much to get it to light up. But this one over here is not very sensitive. This one only fires, maybe it comes from the same place as this one, but it only fires when the signal's really strong, when the sensation is really strong. So the neuron, the postsynaptic neuron, can actually determine or rank these based on their sensitivity. So it's easier to ignore a neuron that cries all the time, but one that almost never cries, if it's actually sending a signal, then we're going to listen. Okay? Another way that the nervous system is able to integrate things is about how the neurons are connected to one another. And these are called circuits. And I've drawn 3 examples here of circuits that we see in the nervous system. This first one is called a converging circuit. It's converging, meaning that there are multiple neurons converging into one. This is what we would use for something like balance. So the information from our eyes about where we are, the information from our inner ears about where we are, the information from our muscles about where our body parts are, all of those neurons are sending information to one neuron, which is integrating that information. The information is converging. Now, in order to respond properly, let's say I'm tripping and falling, and so the information from my eyes and my ears and my muscles is that we're going down, then after we get that information, one neuron can send information to multiple other neurons, let's say to my back muscles, my leg muscles, my arm muscles, so that all of my muscles move and get me back up right. This is called a diverging circuit because it goes from one neuron to many neurons. So these work together to bring information to one place and to send information out to lots of places at the same time. We also have circuits, this one's called a reverberating circuit, which help to amplify the signal. So here, if an action potential is sent to this neuron sends the action potential to this one sends it on, but also comes back and stimulates the neuron before it. So we end up with an action potential stimulating more and more and more and more action potentials. And this is another way that the nervous system knows that something's important. So you can either have multiple neurons giving you excitatory post-potentials like we did in summation, or you can have one neuron firing many times saying, this is important, I'm telling you it's important with my excitatory post-synaptic potentials. And that makes it more likely that the postsynaptic neuron will have an action potential. I hope that made sense. I hope you were able to integrate all of this information.